And so we're very grateful to have Professor Alvaré tonight. Helen Alvare is a professor of law at George Mason University School of Law, where she teaches family law, law and religion, and property law. She publishes on matters concerning marriage, parenting, non-marital households, abortion, and the First Amendment religion clauses. She is faculty advisor to the Law School's Civil Rights Law Journal, chair of the Task Force on Conscience Protection of the Witherspoon Institute at Princeton. She's president of the Chiaroscuro Institute in New York, a consultant for the Pontifical Council of the Laity, and an advisor to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and also a consultant for ABC News. Helen Alvare cooperates with the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the United Nations as a speaker and a delegate to various United Nations conferences concerning women and the family. In addition to her publications in law reviews and other academic journals, Professor Alvaré publishes regularly at thepublicdiscourse.com and in news outlets including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, and the Weekly Standard. She also speaks at academic and professional conferences in the United States, Europe, Latin America, and Australia. I certainly encourage you to go on YouTube, and you can hear a number of conferences that Professor Alvaré has offered that are available on YouTube that you can listen to at home. Prior to joining the faculty of George Mason, Professor Alvaré represented the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops before legislative bodies, academic audiences, and the media, and was a litigation attorney for the Philadelphia law firm of Stradley, Ronan, Stevens, and Young. Professor Alvaré received her law degree from Cornell University School of Law and her master's degree in systematic theology from the Catholic University of America. Her topic tonight is freedom of religion as freedom to serve, and I invite you to join me in welcoming Professor Helen Alvare.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, it's very nice of you to come out on a Saturday night. I'm sure you have more exciting things to do, but I hope we'll have a good discussion. I think we're going to have me talk for about 30 minutes, and thank you so much for that introduction. It really is intended to frighten my enemies, not to bore my friends before I get up and talk, but there you go. So what I want to talk about tonight, and I'll lay out the framework, but I bet you have as many questions as I have observations, so I do want to reserve a lot of time for that conversation. You've probably noticed lately that the major clashes on religious freedom that we've been having in the United States are all wrapped up around, a pretty limited set of issues. There are other clashes, but a lot of them seem to be wrapped up around the questions of respect for life and the question of marriage, right? And it's so interesting that this is where we are today. Different eras have their issues, and it takes a long time to get to the bottom of them. And I'm just fascinated by the fact that this is the clash that we're experiencing today. It also happens to be the case that the two areas of law that I teach are family law on the one hand, and law and religion, that is free exercise establishment law on the other. So my two areas have come crashing together. So Emory University, which has maybe the preeminent law and religion center in the United States, asked me to write a piece for their law review on this, which I'm in development. So I'm going to try out, it's got a couple more months to work on it, so I will try it out on you. Right now it's 50 pages, so we're going to shorten it to like 7. And I'll just lay out the outline of it for you, and you can, we can fill in the blanks during our discussion. So the clash, as I have honed it down more particularly, might be said to be between free exercise of religion and something that I have come to call, there's actually a literature on it from a Harvard development professor that's much longer, but he calls it sexual expressionism, which is, he also calls it sexualityism, which is very confusing to people. What it is seeing the right to perform certain consensual sexual acts, but divorced from the possibility of children as sort of the heart of human freedom. And I know that sounds kind of odd, but that's, if you go through, and you go through the law with me, you'll see. If you look at the one claim, it has to do with same-sex marriage, which is a demand that the state recognize a relationship characterized by emotional and sexual intimacy intrinsically close to the possibility of children. And then the other is the fight to put abortion and contraception either as parts of programs or to force religious entities to somehow cooperate or facilitate or perform. But it is not, generally speaking, just about consensual sexual relations. Both of them are emphasized to be severed or unlinked from the possibility of children. That's what's so interesting about both of these things. And of course, if you look at the Catholic Church's teaching regarding sex, in particular, if you look at some of the better writings, in particular the Love and Responsibility book by John Paul II, which is such a sometimes difficult but marvelous description of what the Church's teaching on this might be about. I also like the Russian Orthodox theologian Vladimir Solovyev and his book, The Meaning of Love, which is unbelievably good on this. You can see that the Church links an opening to life coming from the complementary union of the man and the woman as sort of an essential aspect of its teaching about human sexual expression. So you can see why the demand for rights on the one area and the Catholic Church's take on the understanding about love and marriage and sex and parenting, on the other hand, were bound to come together. To the point right now that it is seen as a zero-sum game. If religious freedom advances, it's seen as a blow to others. So if the Church is allowed to continue to be itself in its social services or its hospitals or in its employment operations, it is seen as something that is problematic for women or for same-sex partners. And how did it get this way? This is what I want to think about. And then I want to talk about how we might have a conversation that, without harming people, without any ad hominem, seeks to allow free exercise to live and to allow everybody at least to understand what it is that we're really trying to do here as church, and also do it without the vitriol that characterizes the current discussion about the clash between sexual expression and religious freedom. So I will start by saying that the hurt on both sides of this clash is really deep, right? Both sides are talking about this clash as if both parties are very, very wounded. For those who want to practice religious freedom, they don't want the government to compel behavior. When the government does it, they're doing it in the name of the Constitution, which is a big, powerful document that can run roughshod over state constitution, state legislation, even popular referenda. When religious groups say they want religious freedom, they are told, like we were in the Windsor case, the Supreme Court's decision on the Defense of Merit Act, that the only reason we would want religious freedom and not to recognize a same-sex marriage or not to facilitate abortion or contraception in healthcare is because we have a hateful animus against persons, and that's what they're telling us. If we don't go along with some of the new laws and regulations in the area of sexual expression, we're faced with large losses, heavy fines, people are faced with unemployment, or even shut businesses, right? Businesses and social services have had to shut down. Hurt is also deeply felt by people who are seeking these sexual expression rights. People who identify as LGBT feel that the states or private religious entities' withholding of recognition of their relationship, which they feel to be the most special in their life, is a rejection of their person, their dignity, their equality. On the part of a woman who wants to use contraception, abortion, she might consider any refusal to provide or facilitate it as an unjustified intrusion into her private decision-making. And in particular, in an arena where women have always done the most work and paid the heaviest prices. So they're saying, you're moving into my arena, telling me what I may and may not do, when I'm the one who has the pregnancy, I'm the one who gives birth, I'm the one who does or does not get an abortion, I'm the one who more often raises the child outside of marriage. In the US, 86% of single-parent households are headed by women. Worldwide, the figure is 94%. of single-parent households are female-headed. So women are saying, so don't you dare talk to me about something in this arena, anything, when I'm the one who is bearing all of the work and the costs here. People might also feel strongly about a refusal to provide poor women contraception and abortion on the grounds that poor women will be hindered by unintended pregnancy from obtaining work or education, that this could be a vehicle for them to reach a place they need to go. So how did we get to this place where we're clashing in terms that both sides feel as very personal and great affronts to their dignity? I'm going to talk to you briefly about the line of US Supreme Court decisions that came to call sexual expression without children a fundamental constitutional right, and in fact eventually came to say that it was identity forming, that what people do as sexual expression is their identity. That is who they are. They're not man or woman, it's their sexual expression itself, and then came to use that identity language in connection with other cases like race cases and sex discrimination cases, so that the language of human right to have that identity became became part and parcel of the conversation about same-sex marriage or about abortion and contraception. So I'll do a quick zip through those cases for you. Then I'm going to talk briefly about how it is that, in particular, the Roman Catholic traditions growing out into all of these various public services, religious, charitable, education, healthcare, et cetera, and the governments imposing more and more and more and more laws, particularly anti-discrimination laws, mandatory benefits laws, so that it's almost like, I don't know how many of you went to law school, but there's this famous case called Spur versus Webb in property law, which I teach to first years, where a stinky, they were, what do they call it? They fed cows, basically, and then slaughtered them. I forget it. It was a cow feed lot. Was growing. At the same time that Webb, the producer of housing for seniors, was growing. And both of them deliberately grew toward each other until finally Webb sued the feed lot to shut down because it was stinky. Well, all the time the feds and state governments, too, are passing more and more and more and more and more laws, anti-discrimination, mandatory benefits laws. The Catholic Church and all of its employers and social service and healthcare and education institutions are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're growing toward each other. And eventually the federal government starts giving massive amounts of grants and contracts to the Catholic Church, and then imposing more and more and more requirements on them, and eventually the clash becomes very specific. And I will trace that for you very briefly. And then finally, I will briefly consider how to maintain constitutional free exercise in such an environment, particularly when we have in the United States very favorable media treatment for this form of sexual expression and against free exercise of religion. And also where in the United States, the more educationally privileged and more well-off you are, the more likely you are to support this particular forms of sexual expression. It's just a fact. With every more year of education and the higher income, most people are more likely to support these constitutional rights to sexual expression unlinked from children. It's just a fact. So let's first talk about the development of the cases. Before the 1970s, the state definitely took an interest at the state level in state family laws in linking sex, kids, and marriage. And those old laws were laws banning what they used to call fornication, cohabitation, adultery, okay? They were enforced unevenly, but the state definitely, in cases in related areas, confirmed the legitimacy of those state interests. They said, no, it's, the state has the police power, health, safety, welfare. The family is the territory in which all human beings are formed. We have to do our best to keep the family in good shape. In a lot of countries around the world, I was just reading about Korea. Korea still enforces these laws regularly on the state interest in keeping the family strong. One can have very good disputes about whether it works, but the state asserted that interest. Beginning in 1965, however, the Supreme Court started to craft a new framework for considering rights respecting sexual expression. They called it the right to privacy. In the 1965 case concerning Connecticut's ban on the sale and use of contraception, it was the Griswold case, the court found a right of privacy, not in the text of the Constitution, but in what they called the penumbras and emanations of other guarantees in the Constitution. And they said that this right of privacy was broad enough to encompass two things: the decisions that married people made about their sex life and about children. They said that's very private. And combined that with the marital bedroom. And they said, we can't go in there, and these are married people. And the way they put it was, we deal with the privacy older than the Bill of Rights, older than political parties. Marriage is a coming together, for better or worse, hopefully enduring, and intimate to the degree of being sacred. It is an association for as noble a purpose as involved in all of our prior decisions. So the right of privacy inhered in marriage and in the marital bedroom. 7 years later, however, in Eisenstadt versus Baird, the court extended the right of privacy to cover the right of single folks to buy and use contraception, okay? And they made a big leap here, and listen to how they put it. The marital couple is not an independent entity with a mind and heart of its own, but an association of two individuals with a separate intellectual and emotional makeup. If the right of privacy means anything, it's the right of the individual to be free from unwarranted governmental intrusion into matters so fundamentally affecting a person as the decision whether to bear or beget a child. What they did in that case was now privacy wasn't in between a married couple or in a marital bedroom. Privacy is a thing the court says attaches to really important decisions in your life. If it's really, really important, then it has a constitutional guarantee. That's what it seemed to say. The right of an individual to be free from unwarranted governmental intrusion into matters fundamentally affecting a person. It's a lot of stuff. By the way, interestingly, the polygamists immediately went, ooh, we can win now. And they tried to get to the Supreme Court, and the Seventh Circuit said, no, the right of privacy is not broad enough. Why? It's not. Well, why? Because they didn't want it to be. So what that tells you is the right of privacy means whatever 5 justices say it means. It's a little nerve-wracking. Anyway, on its face, this language, as I said, could have much broader purchase. It could include polygamy. It could also include a right to kill yourself, right? That's a matter fundamentally affecting a person. But the Supreme Court said, no, it wasn't that broad. So they just sort of drew lines that nobody could understand, right? They, not surprisingly, right after Eisenstadt, in Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton, the court extended the right of privacy to cover legal abortion throughout all 9 months of pregnancy for any reason. Even in the last trimester, it said no state could stop a woman who wanted an abortion for reasons, quote, familial or her age or emotional, psychological, any other reason. So that, too, was now broad enough to be in the right of privacy. And the court said, we have to, because if we don't give her the right of abortion, she may be very, very, very psychologically unhappy. So here, it wasn't tied so much to decisions affecting her person as it was to, she will just be flat out miserable if she doesn't have a right not to have a child when she doesn't want one. The decision that really gave us the language that led to today's predicament, where sexual expression without kids is identity, is the 1992 abortion decision, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Casey declared flat out that women have relied on abortion as a backstop for failed contraception in order to plan their lives as to be equal and participating members of the economy. We just said it straight out. It said that these were going to be lives that involved sexual relationships, but without children, when they would be a barrier to women's equality and economic progress. The famous line from Casey, it's called the mystery passage, but I always refer to it as the wacko passage, because it's just, you can just hear the Star Trek-y music coming in when I say it. This is what they said now the right of privacy was. This is a constitutional right we're describing here. These matters, involving the most intimate and personal choices a person may make in a lifetime, choices central to the personal dignity and autonomy, are central to the liberty protected by the 14th Amendment. At the heart of this liberty is the right to define one's concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. So now this is what the constitutional right of privacy is. Anytime you want to define your own concept of existence, meaning the universe and the mystery of life. And they said that had to include the right to abortion because it's about the mystery of life and the meaning of your universe. 11 years later, the court took a further step toward making consensual sexual expression divorced from kids a central part of the formation of identity, dignity, personhood, universe formation, etc. In Lawrence versus Texas, the court struck down Texas's criminal ban on homosexual sodomy, saying, individual decisions concerning the intimacies of physical relationships, even when not intended to produce offspring, are a form of constitutional liberty. Okay, so now we have a constitutional right to sexual expression unrelated to kids. Citing Casey, the court stated this is because these sexual acts are part of people's defining their concept of existence, meaning, and human life. So do you see, it started with a married couple in a marital place, then it became decisions. Those decisions really meant decisions about having sex. Then it went from decisions about having sex and not having kids vis-a-vis abortion to decisions about having any sex unrelated to children, so same-sex relationships. Then, and then those were then linked with formation of identity, okay? The Lawrence language, while the Lawrence court specifically disclaimed any intention to use the constitutional privacy guarantee to provide a basis for constitutional same-sex marriage, its language was nevertheless cited by the Windsor Court years later, what was that, 2 years ago, when the Supreme Court struck down the Defense of Marriage Act, Section 3. What it said was this. It cited Lawrence, and it said, marriage is a state's acknowledging the intimate, it meant sexual relationship between two persons. That's what Justice Kennedy spent 7 pages saying, states have the last word on marriage, but here's what marriage is. And then he just, 7 pages, and then the gentleman doth protest too much and said, it's this. And he cited only one case for the definition of marriage, and it was his own opinion in the Lawrence case. And he said, marriage is acknowledging the intimate relationship between two people. So Windsor said, because this is what marriage is, when any government tries to take two people who have a sexual relationship and say that's not a marriage, there can only be one reason that government did it, because it is intrinsically a marriage, he said. That's what they're having. So he said they only are doing it out of animus, because it is a marriage. He said he didn't say that, but that's what the opinion actually did say. This is what a marriage is. There's a further line of reasoning in both Windsor and affirmed in another case that led to the current practice of equating sexual expression without kids and identity at a constitutional level. The Lawrence court said disapproval of any consensual sexual act is equivalent to disapproval of the people who undertake it. So if you don't approve of a sexual act, that constitutes animus against people who wish to do it. Okay? He wrote in that case, when homosexual conduct is made criminal by the law of a state, that is an invitation to subject homosexual persons to discrimination. His opinion for the majority in Windsor made the same connection, saying that when a state refuses to recognize that conduct between two people as marriage, animus is the only rational explanation. He said he didn't get into the argument about children. He didn't even address it. The Christian Legal Society decision, which I don't have time to go into right now, in which the only group at a California State University that had been denied student sponsorship, or excuse me, university sponsorship, because they wouldn't take people who hated their mission as leaders. All other student groups got to say, everybody can join, but if you want to be a leader for our group, you have to agree with this mission statement. Well, all of a sudden, when Christian Legal Society submitted the same constitution as all these prior groups, the university said, no, we can't have that because you're violating the university's anti-discrimination policy. And they said, well, no, we're not. That says we can't discriminate against people, race, sex, national origin, sexual orientation. People of every sexual orientation are allowed in our group. People of every sexual orientation are allowed to be leaders of our group, they said. What you can't do is behave in opposition to our principles and refuse to say that's a problem. You have to say, I made a mistake, and according to Christian Legal Society principles, I should try and fix that. And the university said that's not good enough. And what they wrote in that, it said, our decisions have declined to distinguish between status and conduct. To disapprove of a person's sexual conduct and their belief about it is to discriminate against a person. Sexual conduct is identity. Okay, so this is how we got there. The other thing they did is that they tied laws curbing sexual expression with kind of victimish language. They did it in ways that make any law curbing the behavior subject to a very intense level of constitutional scrutiny. What they really tried to do, for the most part, is get the level of constitutional scrutiny that we direct at laws discriminating based on race applied to these other cases. So constantly, the anti-miscegenation case, Loving versus Virginia, where Virginia has had a law banning the marriage of black and white. Loving versus Virginia is always the case brought into the same-sex marriage opinions because they said that was based on identity and this is based on identity. Even though Loving versus Virginia affirmed that the reason that that law was struck down, not only because it was racially discriminatory, but because it clearly couldn't have a basis in rational fact because a man and a woman were marrying. And therefore, they were, by definition of marriage, having a marriage. So the way they do it then in the contraception and abortion case is by fingering motherhood as the practical and political lever by which women as a sex, that is, women on the whole, are marginalized, while contraception and abortion could be the antidote to that. Thus, the Casey language that women have depended upon abortion for their economic and social place in the nation, okay? So once you set up that women, decisions not to have children are related to a decision for equality or for economic participation in the nation, then any opposition to contraception and abortion becomes anti-woman. If you look at the briefs of Health and Human Services in the mandate cases, by the time they got to the Supreme Court, they said women need free contraception because women need to participate in the economy equally. There are other options, right? I mean, they could have things like, leave and flexible work policies, et cetera, for women, but the Casey decision, the HHS mandate said if you don't agree with free contraception facilitated by religious and non-religious employers, then you are, as former Secretary of HHS said, Kathleen Sebelius, you are conducting a war on women. Okay, and therefore religious freedom and women's rights is a zero-sum game in that. Okay, so that's how it got that way. Okay. This is echoed by literature that's in the paper, but I don't have time to go on and on about literature and cultural developments that elevated sexual expression and pushed down the value of children simultaneously. So the gap got bigger and bigger. And you can look at the work of Sigmund Freud, Marcuse, Margaret Sanger, Betty Friedan, the discussion about what birth control and abortion would accomplish for the happiness of marriage and couples. Wilhelm Reich, Freud's disciple, wrote that, his amazing, sexual energy is the constructive biological energy, the productive vital energy. The core of life's happiness is sexual happiness. Margaret Sanger, who said that once married women could use contraception, their sex lives would improve immeasurably. Their husbands would be for their wives veritable gods, worthy of their profoundest worship. Through sex, she will attain the great spiritual illumination which will transform the world and light up a holy path to an earthly paradise. And it's interesting because if you read Betty Friedan and Simone de Beauvoir's books in the 50s and 60s, they sort of indicated, they indicated the same thing. Taking children out of the equation would be the great innovation, the great happiness for the man and the woman, okay? So the value of sexual expression without kids was going way up, and then the value of kids themselves was going way down, for a variety of reasons. The particular way it was framed in the feminist movement, the fact that the home economy was no longer the economy that produced wealth for a family. Children were a cost, not an addition to the home economy. You were consuming things, not producing things together as a family, and so forth. So all of this is going on. At the same time, then, you had two other things happening. You have an enormous amount, and I'm going to deal just with the Catholic data here, of Catholic involvement in the public square, more and more and more. And just to give you a few data points on this, Catholic hospitals, by 1915, there were 600, 1936, 675. Now we have 549 serving almost 89 million Americans annually, okay? Respecting schools, today, 2.7 million American kids in parish religious education, 1.4 million in 5,400 Catholic elementary schools, 583,000 in 1,200 Catholic high schools, and 200 Catholic universities. Catholic Charities, the umbrella name, as you know, for hundreds and hundreds of local Catholic charitable agencies, the largest private charity in the United States. Only the government spends more. They are now producing services yearly for 9 to 12 million Americans, right? They serve, they're in every state. They do adoption, they do health care, they do orphanages, they do every kind of social service you can think of. At the same time, they are so good and so efficient that they've been attracting this enormous amount of government funding. If you ever want to see who gets what grants from the government, there's this fabulous website, usaspending.gov. You can find very easily that every year, for the last many, many years, just Catholic refugee services get between $2 and $23 million a year. Every year. And I should say several grants per year in that range. Catholic Charities, annually, from just the federal government, is getting $440 million to $550 million a year, every year. So the government, in its grants and contracts, has the right to set the terms for those. Additionally, you've got Catholics as a quarter of the population, experiencing tremendous economic mobility, owning businesses, housing, occupying government positions. They are pharmacists, nurses, teachers, all of which categories are affected by the regulations that I'll be describing right now. Just again, a very quick review of them. You've got not only the Civil Rights Act of 1964 with respect to employers and discrimination. You've got the Fair Housing Act in 1968, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. You've got many local governments that added to the non-discrimination categories of these laws, which were generally race, sex, national origin, religion, etc. They added things like marital status, meaning marriage or single. That means cohabiting versus married. They added things like sexual orientation. Additionally, federal law became more broadly interpreted, so that the word, for instance, disability, could be interpreted in a federal law to cover a person who refused to do housing or something else involving a commercial service for a same-sex couple who had a state marriage license, on the grounds that that was a person's viewing them through the disability lens. Refusing to insure for birth control or abortion got labeled sex discrimination, even though it wasn't about a feeling about women versus men. But the courts allowed these labels to be attached to things they were probably never meant to be attached to. Then, of course, you've got the non-discrimination laws with regard to commercial services providers. And now you've got things like the healthcare mandate, which says certain kinds of things have to be in health insurance, or even certain kinds of providers and institutions have to actually provide certain kinds of services that would be against Catholic conscience. So you've got the growth of all of these Catholic services interacting with and controlled by government laws, and more and more and more and more and more government laws that are pushing Catholic employers and charitable institutions to do things that are against their conscience. And I have that charted with all these sort of historic footnotes about the development of non-discrimination laws and healthcare mandates, and then the growth of the Catholic social services. So there's a lot to that. So, but I want to ask finally what to do in this environment, right? I think there are two possible paths to take. None of them are difficult. The environment is quite poisonous on this now, I think. Again, it's being seen as a zero-sum contest where some people want religious freedom at the expense of other people's freedom and dignity. That's how it's being characterized. It's a very difficult situation. I think there are two arguments that I would try and make. The first one is that Catholic witness, Catholic services, Catholic messages perform tremendous beneficial social function. The second is, I think, to explain to people that they don't actually understand the degree to which, in the Catholic mind, our teaching about sex, marriage, parenting, family life is actually tied up with, this will sound odd, but our entire cosmic worldview. And I'll start with that point and then go to the others. People, this language, the Church's scriptural teachings, the theology of the body, the way that Pope Francis has written about it in Evangelium Gaudium, in some of his talks to young married couples, people aren't quite aware on the outside that the fact in the Church, the fact that God creates the human being, male and female, is understood, and the complementary union of them and the fruitfulness of that union, it's being the source of all human life. I mean, again, God could have put children anywhere, right? He could have put creation of new life anywhere. He put it in the relationship between the man and the woman, all of human society. We actually believe and teach that this tells us something about the image of God. So the very identity of God, in our view, our ability to understand who he is and what he meant by making man and woman, and also fruitful in his image, is at stake. We also have the Catholic teaching about the fact that marriage, we see it from the beginning of the Old Testament to the end of the New, we see it particularly in St. Paul. Marriage is a way of understanding God's relationship with God's people. That we really can't understand that love until we actually understand marital love. St. Paul says it in Ephesians. We have a great deal of teaching on that. The third aspect is that this kind of mutually sacrificial love that brings life is actually, again, what we understand marriage to be, is actually the way we understand Jesus Christ's love for the human person, and how the human person is therefore to love other people. So, again, I've got all the footnotes and the teaching laid out on that. It's old scriptural teaching, it's Vatican II, it's JP2, it's Benedict, it's Francis. It's a very consistent teaching of the Church. So I don't think people are clear that asking us to have a new understanding or to facilitate a new understanding of marriage or parenting or human sexuality is really like asking us to practice another religion. It's asking us to change our understanding of human love as image of God in some glimpse of a fashion. And I do think we need to do a whole lot better job explaining how closely this is tied. This is not some extraneous set of issues over here. This is not political. It's not something we dreamed up in order to respond to current tensions. It's actually a deep part of our theology. The other way, I think, to address this issue is to talk about the beneficial social functions of Catholic witness on sexual expression. It was very interesting to me during the 2 weeks of the Synod, watching a great deal of the news. One of the things you saw in some of the Protestant websites is that, we're all depending on the Catholic Church to be the bulwark of marriage. We're all depending on it. Go church, do your best. I remember I teach family law, and one of the books that I use is a guy named Max Reinstein, who was the a very eminent family law professor at U Chicago. He taught Mary Ann Glendon, who was then my mentor. And Reinstein has a whole chapter at the end devoted to the Catholic Church and its teaching on marriage and what a great benefit it is to society at large. And how horrible it would be if our understanding of permanent, faithful, fruitful, exclusive goes by the boards. We know today so many things about what happens when that's a problem, right? We know that women and men are immiserated, but women are immiserated in very particular ways, right? They're the people who are pregnant alone, raising the children alone, having the abortions alone, and suffering post-abortion distress alone. There are the people who really don't have the upper hand when it comes to deciding about marriage, and more women who would like to be married or not married, or they're cohabiting and they really don't want to cohabit. If you look at that data, it's in populations where there is a scarcity of women, there's like almost no cohabitation. In population where there's a scarcity of men, there's a bunch of cohabitation, okay? And if you ask women, what does this cohabitation mean to you? Like 92% are like, oh, it means we're gonna get married. And the guys are like, I don't know, we're dating a lot. I mean, it's really, women are immiserated in a very particular way. And the fact that cohabitation is the second largest predictor of divorce, right? Women don't tend to remarry as much, men do tend to remarry. Women are immiserated in a very particular way. The next thing is that the poor are immiserated more than anybody else. In the United States now, an African American woman in particular, 52% will never marry. That's a lot. If you really believe that there is something very particular and beautiful and special about the relationship between a man and a woman, then this is now being confined as a luxury item to some people and not others. And the Hispanic population that's coming into the United States is going in the exact same direction. And now you see that well-off and well-educated Americans are drastically more likely to marry and have marital children and stay married than people without a college degree or without a high school degree. It is, they said, the largest predictor of a lack of social mobility in the United States now is marriage. That this gap between the rich and the poor is driven by marriage and education. Okay, the data on this is, when the New York Times is covering it and saying, you know, there's not really a disagreement between the left and the right on this, you know you've reached sort of a basis that we can hopefully move forward on and do something about. I could go on about the variety of ways that the church's teaching here has been a great benefit to the public square, right? To women, to the poor, to whole communities that depend on the stability of marriage, to children who there really isn't any question that the number one predictor, you know, it doesn't count for everything, but the number one predictor of their situation, educationally, emotionally, et cetera, family structure just comes out huge, right? The way that Pope Francis is talking about, speaking about this, the language that he's asking us to use, he's asking us to go out and invite people on this. It's a hugely important issue, not because it's political and not because we want to pick a fight, but it is very, very fundamental at this time, and things are really falling apart. Not just in the United States, but I have with me in my briefcase a book that I'm just taking notes on now. It's you know, it's family law developments in every country around the world. Once a year it's put out as a yearbook. It's all about the falling apart of the relationship between the man and the woman, and the difficult situations under which children are being born, or the situations under which children are not welcome, right? And then all the fallout of that. That's, you go through this, 120 countries, and that's what you're seeing in the law. Okay, so I think the Catholic Church has a tremendous amount to offer. I really, the hand-wringing on the Evangelical Protestant website during the last couple of weeks in the Synod going, we're really counting on the Church to do great things because we really need the Church to be this tremendous voice in these arenas. That told me a lot, right? We really do have a tremendous argument to make that is beneficial in the social square. It's not easy. Our argument is not always welcome, but the data is very, very clear. We have it, and I think it has to be proposed in goodwill, intelligently, truthfully. And it's just, you know, for me, a possible strategy for maintaining the goods that we have and free exercise at the same time. I think I'll just stop there. There's so much more I could say, but I think that's plenty to get started, and thank you very much. Oh, sure. You know, there was a belief for a while that maybe the government could make up the difference, right? Now, in the U.S., we've never come close to that. I mean, we just don't have enough money, and because now we have 41% of all births in the U.S. are outside of marriage. 41%. 4 out of every 10. We could never make up that difference. But in one country where they tried, so it was a natural experiment, Sweden's social welfare programs are so generous that they have brought the gap between married and unmarried households down to 3%, and they have the same differences in outcome that we do. So again, it doesn't stop us from needing to provide social welfare. All I'm saying is the idea that it's going to substitute for a certain kind of family stability is just not going to happen.
This summer I was at Napa Institute out in
Oh, yeah.
California. And there was a discussion at a meeting the day before the conference about human resource issues that Catholic dioceses are facing. And the issue is this: more and more dioceses are being sued by their employees over different issues, such as the lesbian faculty member at the Catholic high school who uses in vitro to become pregnant in a relationship with a female partner. And then the school acts on letting the person go, and then there's a lawsuit over that. So what they're talking about doing is putting language in all the teachers' contracts that very explicitly states, here are things that the church teaches, here is what you must not publicly do to veer from that, and that your employment is linked to that. So people like Bishop Vasha in Santa Rosa and others, they really are looking at this language. There's a very important case in Seattle. We just had an incident involving a music director here in the Archdiocese. So these are very real issues. Where do you see something like that going in terms of how the church handles that, but also recognizing, because the church is so large an employer, it's a good thing in terms of the good that the church can do. It's also a risk because you've got lots of people working for the church who I'm not sure they're there necessarily because it's out of their faith, or even in some cases, I'm not quite sure how educated somebody is about what the church believes to begin with. Hence, let's put the explicit language into the contract so there's no surprises down the road. I just be curious about your thoughts.
I think there's a couple of moving parts here. One, you can see it's really difficult because of the environment and the way the battle lines are drawn up, and everyone thinks they know the terms of the debate. And it's people who are for people and people who are against people. And we've been put on the against people side quite often. But we really do, and this is where Pope Francis's call for new language makes so much sense to me. We really have got to talk about our teachings not only in reaction to crises that crop up, and not in what cannot be done terms, but in our obligation to provide for the next generation the main thing that human beings want, which is, their roots, their stability, the unconditional love. It's not always possible, and when it's not, we try to fill in for those difficulties. But we can't go along with deliberately setting up that problem for people. And the data, it's so ironic, of course, because we've never had more data that shows conclusively how important family structure is. And again, when things happen, things fall apart, we do our best, but we don't say we're going to facilitate setting up this situation for the child. So I think we've got to be more proactive and not be afraid to go out there and speak. I'm telling you, I'm in the Family Law Academy. There's very few who would agree with me. Couple in the United States. Just a couple, 3, 4. So the church, but in humility, as a service, has got to be, just when we'd like to stick our head down is actually when we need to stick it out more and have people witnessing to this. And in humility, people who think they know what they're talking about sometimes have to go learn how to say it nicer and better, truly. The other thing is that these institutions, which are so many and sometimes very large, they've definitely given these employees often the signal, don't worry, we don't take this stuff seriously. So, the employees come in with that understanding, and they're shocked when at some point a line is drawn. Anybody would be. So again, and this is, maybe my husband, who's, a lot tougher than I am, he'd be like, you're being too nice, honey. You're all about what we have to do. But, that's what we are. We're Catholics, First first serve. And I just think that we really, as institutions, we can't shy away from these issues. You know, or any issue that's Catholic. Right now, immigration is a huge issue. Right now, war is a huge issue. Right now, poverty. Right now, marriage. Right now, out-of-wedlock births. All together, we have to be very free at the very beginning with the employees about what we stand for, or they have every right to be shocked. Doesn't mean they have a right to sue us, because the terms of employment, particularly from the Supreme Court's decision just a few terms ago with regard to a Lutheran minister and the terms of her employment, the Supreme Court said very clearly that the actions of ministers cannot be controlled by the federal government. Even though it was really frightening, the federal government, the Obama administration argued that, that the feds had the right to step in the hiring and firing of a minister. That was very frightening. They're also arguing in all the Hobby Lobby cases, the style cases of the HHS mandate, that the federal government has a right to tell you whether your conscience is violated, that that's not something that the individual believer. Their argument in all their briefs, and I just debated with a guy the other day, a couple days ago at George Mason on this, is that you can say that your conscience is violated by something, but the federal government actually gets to make that decision. And if they set up a benefit, not to give it is by definition to harm a person. So anything they would set up, this is why even when they argue this in the Supreme Court, Justice Kennedy goes, even abortion, that you could mandate, and the Solicitor General didn't have an answer. Well, that would be different, that's forbidden. He said, yes, forbidden now, but you just said you could do anything. And that for anyone to refuse to provide it would be harming the people who didn't get it. And he had no answer for that. So they're going to be pushing against us on this, but we can set these terms. But as a matter of fairness, and for the public not to revile us for setting up employees with different expectations, we'd better be clear with people right from the beginning that this is an institution, and religion is part of its mission and more than name or history. And can I say one other thing, is that there's a market for our ideas. Like, on the one hand, you're sitting here thinking, we're just pushing against a very aggressive counter-messaging. But when I go speak, remember the Cardinal O'Connor conference at Georgetown University, or when I've spoken at conferences of people, college students, et cetera, you know, I'll have 300 to 500 young women line up and go, yeah, that's exactly what it's like in my world, and the church is doing a better job. You know, the sex mating and marriage market out there for the 20-year-old is not to my liking. The church makes me feel safer. I wish that was the prevailing way. But we have to be all cheerful and positive and full of facts about our ideas. But there is so completely a market out there for these ideas. It is a difficult environment, but the market remains. Okay, why don't well, how about here, and then the gentleman in the yellow, yes.
Well, speaking of the environment, I voted early on Monday, and the calls do stop. And there was an advisory referendum. Should all providers of health care, health insurance in the state of Illinois, be required to provide birth control? So would you please give an update on the Little Sisters and the lawsuits going on? Right.
So you know that in the Hobby Lobby case, the Supreme Court had a decision that for-profit corporations have a statutory right of free exercise. Okay, that they get to decide if they are burdened. So far they said, but that was only 5-4. And Justice Kennedy is wobbly even on that, in his opinion, that the religious person or group gets to decide if their religious conscience is violated. So that's still by a razor-thin majority on the Supreme Court with us. But that the federal government could force insurers to provide this, that is, employers providing insurance, in a less intrusive way. The problem is the less intrusive way that the majority named is the way that the Little Sisters and others have been compelled to provide it. So they sort of indicated that while that wasn't available to Hobby Lobby, the big craft chain, that what is currently available to the Little Sisters of the Poor, fill out a form saying to the government, here's my insurance company, here's my insured, you provide it through my insurance to them, but I won't have my hands on it except it's the insurance that I'm giving them as my employees and you're inserting the stuff in it. They said that might be the least restrictive means of forcing people. So we really don't know the answer. And it may be, the Little Sisters case isn't the next one to come up to the court. There's a few others that may go more quickly than that. It may be that we win that, and they say, you just can't reach in to a religious employer or insurance entity and force them to do something against their will, profit or nonprofit. But it may also be that they say that the federal government's telling them, just fill out a form, we'll mail it to women and their minor daughters. Without having to involve you, except for the fact that you employed these people and you bought the insurance. That's not, we don't know where that's going to end up yet. We think we have a great argument, but I just debated people on the government side a couple of days ago, and they ridicule the idea that it's possibly a burden on our religion for the government to reach into our institutions and force them to cover things. And if contraception, if that's okay on principle, then abortion's definitely okay on principle too. So is assisted suicide medicine. And the irony is, of course, if you actually go look at all the places where the government issues reports about women's health, which I did for a congressional hearing that I testified at, and everything that NIH, the National Institute of Health issues, everything the White House Office of Women and Girls issues, everything that Health and Human Services issues, the Institute of Medicine, you go through all their reports on the health of women. You do not find in any of them a statement that more contraception and abortion is needed in America. It's fascinating. It's all about blood clots, heart attacks, strokes, cancer, you know, the stuff that most women have. There's a glut of birth control in the market. Even the long-acting forms are cheaper month to month than the still cheap stuff across the counter. It's a campaign about an idea of what women's freedom means. It has nothing to do with women's health. I've been trying to get this across through a group that I started online called Women Speak for Themselves. I've got 43,000 women signed up. Anybody want to sign up on it? It's called womenspeakforthemselves.com. And I send updates to women about how they can do stuff on this. And they're saying all women are on one side. And I'm going, no, I've got 43,000 on this side. But somehow they're not visible to the press. But we're still fighting that one. Here, so you, and then over to you. Yeah. If your employer has over 50 people, there are certain services that will be in your policy whether you want them or not.
I thought for instance, Kaiser, for instance, could select a certain program such that your dollar would not go towards.
No, they said they could, but then what happened is you may have seen that the Congressional Budget Office just put out an analysis like a month ago of supposedly you would have a policy and you'd say, I don't want abortion in my policy. You can't get contraception out, but you could say, I want abortion out. But what would happen is the feds wouldn't be paying it, but you would still have to send a certain amount of money if you had abortion in your policy, and you don't have a choice over that with Kaiser. You may on some state plans. Some state exchanges have to have one plan that excludes abortion. But it turns out you just have to send that money to a separate place where they claim that the abortion money is being segregated. But to make a long, complicated actuarial story short, it turns out it's not being segregated. It turns out that people's ordinary insurance premiums are going into the same funds with the money that's being used to pay abortions. The Congressional Budget Office just put something out on that about a month ago that said, no, you're paying for abortion. You know, one of the things I've seen lately is, you may have seen it in the very early reports on the Synod. I think the Pope might have used this language, but it may have been some of the bishops. They talked about marital preparation from beginning of grade school. They used the expression severe, like much more focused, much more long-term. it's not all of what you're talking about, but that's part of it. The other thing is, I agree with you that it's very common, particularly because of the conversation around violence, sexual assault, rape, to have everything being defending the woman. Everything is about the woman being put upon. And definitely my story of the current sex mating and marriage market is women who would like to be married a little younger, women who would like to have their kids a little younger than they're having them, women who sure would like to have options to have both work and children, but to be more flexible in their work lives, to be able to do something interesting, but not to have to be at it throughout their entire years of bearing and raising kids. So that story is there, but it does tend to leave the men out of the story.
We're not marketing that.
Yeah.
And then they're not doing their part.
That's why I think the conversation has got to be about, I think we have to look at the complementary relationship between men and women and attend to both. We're forgetting, I mean, we're so, I don't know what your broadside newspaper is in Chicago, but New York Daily News, the Philadelphia Daily News, whatever, these kind of junk papers about celebrities with some really good sports in the back. That's what we think is the marketplace of relationships we're swimming in. It's not what most people are experiencing in their lives, thank God. But it's the caricature of what it's like out there. And until we recall that there was supposed to be something particularly gorgeous between men and women, and then try and recall that and explore it better, because over time through history, between inequality and patriarchy and then women's backlash, etc., it hasn't looked so good. But I do think we have to recover that now is the time. Yeah.
I know you gave an abridged version of what your whole paper is on, but I noticed when you were going through the legal documents, you didn't talk too much about divorce and how divorce has changed over time. Is there a reason for that?
Well, it wasn't about sexual identity. I was only tracing how sexual acts divorced from children became a constitutional right. And religious freedom came. But yeah, I mean, I've written a couple papers about no-fault divorce, and I did a paper in a Stanford Law Review comparing no-fault divorce, new reproductive technologies, and the development of same-sex marriage law. They actually, if you look at their architecture, they arose in the exact same way. So it's really interesting. Not my paper, but the topic. I mean, my paper is long and interesting to the 6 people who read it, but which is the way of all law reviews. But yeah, that was what if you really look at between, no-fault divorce got started in like 65, right? And you got no-fault divorce between 65 and 77, sweeps the country. Then you have Eisenstadt versus Baird. The individual gets to decide about kids. It's not the couple, 72. Abortion, 73. First test tube baby, 78. Then you have cohabitation start to pick up in the 80s. The abortion rate is 1.6 million by the mid-80s. And then you have the same-sex marriage cases coming again and again and again in the courts all through the 90s. And if you look at their architecture, they were all quite similar. So it is a part of it, just not a part of this narrower story. Let me take someone in the back, because people in the back never. Yes, hi. And then I'll come up to you.
It occurs to me that the government would actually have a compelling interest in not defining individual identity and individual freedom in terms of sexual activity that does not lead to reproduction, because it seems to me that especially as we're looking at the Congressional Budget Office's prediction that Social Security will be bankrupt in 2034, that there's a legitimate state interest in promoting children, and quite frankly, if you believe the 2034 prediction, you're drunk, you're delusional. It's going to be bankrupt faster than that.
Interesting.
The way healthcare is advancing. How can they square the ideology that they have with those cold hard facts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can only surmise a couple of things. Number one, we're still replacement rate here in the U.S., right? We're about 2.1 kids per couple. So they haven't hit the panic button yet. We're still an attractive place for immigration. Number two, though, they are so long committed to sexual expression, and now they're kind of like giddy with it. The judges in these circuit courts who are striking down all of these state-passed laws on marriage, I mean, they're kind of like, they all want their 15 minutes of fame in the New York Times or something. It's sort of like, their opinions are silly, is the only way to put it. I mean, Posner's opinion was just, I mean, they would be embarrassing in any other time. But they're all kind of like, you know, he did it, she did it, I'm going to do it too. But the idea, if you go look at 120 years of Supreme, when I wrote my amicus brief in the Windsor case, I went through every single Supreme Court opinion relating to marriage recognition. What is marriage? From 1870 through 1983. And in 100% of cases, the court said, marriage, the state is interested in marriage because the state is interested in making sure children are born and reared in a family. Even when it wasn't raised in the case, they would just say it. There was this fascinating, the attorneys, David Boies, et cetera, argued in their opinion that there was a Supreme Court case in which they said a man who was in prison could get married because marriage was, you know, an emotional and spiritual and sexual connection, and he could have that. But they left out the part of the Supreme Court's opinion where they said, well, he's allowed to get married because he's going to be able to get out of prison and have a sexual relationship with his wife and have kids. But if he was in for life, then we would say he can't get married because what he would have is not a marriage in the eyes of the state. I mean, they just left that stuff out of their brief. It was just amazing. So even when marriage was not, the question about procreation wasn't even on the table, the Supreme Court always put it in its opinion. So for them now to say, children, what children? That has nothing to do with the state reason for marriage recognition. It's just, they're really just making it up out of thin air. I don't know how else to put it. It's the same way they made up the right of privacy to concern abortion, because some people, some slight majority of justices decided yes. But I just think they're closing their eyes to the demographic situation, and they really are very committed, and more so in the language about people's emotional and sexual relationships as utterly central to what marriage is and what the state is interested in your life. So it's very odd. Yeah, I guess the last question, and then for time, okay.
How compromised is the church, at least hierarchically, in addressing this issue in the public square when we have to defend against our own felonies and misdemeanors?
Very.
In the area of child sexual.
Yeah. We're very compromised. But on the other hand, Bill Clinton still makes arguments in the public square and gets listened to. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, there are things that I remember when, you know, Bill Clinton was driving me crazy on abortion, but he was doing great stuff on free trade, and my husband was working on trade issues. And you know, you'd have to listen to him and go, wow, that's pretty good, you know, on this issue. And whenever I would be shy about doing something at school, I'd say, oh, I don't know if I know about that. I shouldn't say anything. My dean would always say to me, think about Bill Clinton for a minute and then speak up. It's a joke in my life. But yes, we are. There is no question. And we deserve to be compromised on that. Definitely, particularly when we have very specific facts and timelines and problems coming out of trials and grand jury reports. At the same time, what we are trying to say on these other issues happens to be true, and it happens to be good for people. And lots of people who have done bad things also do good things. And to say that we abdicate, when I'm looking around and there aren't too many willing to take their licks on this. And I get it, and particularly it's difficult for priests, because the issues of abortion and contraception in particular, they're told stay out of it. But the church's teaching is so thick and so profound on it. Plus now the literature supporting it from the both qualitative and quantitative, sociological, economic, psychological, is so thick that I'm not willing to just say, all right, we should stand aside. But I can't disagree with you that we're compromised.
Thank you again, Helen, and thank you for being here.
And the Lord God said, It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him an helpmeet for him. The Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs, closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib, which the Lord God had taken from man, made he a woman, and brought her unto the man.